Kia ora. Welcome to the New Zealand Sim Nurse NZ podcast. My name is Erin.
And I'm Alison.
And I'm Marie.
We are the three nurse educators from the Douglas Starship Simulation Program based in Auckland, New Zealand. We're all passionate about our work, and so we'd like to welcome you to join us as we have a range of conversations about all things sim.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kei ngā maunga whakahi, kei ngā wai tukukiri, kei ngā mā tawaka o te motu, ka nui te mihi kia koutou. To those who connect to the mountains, the rivers and oceans across the land, hello and welcome to you all.
Welcome to today's episode. Today we are incredibly honoured to be interviewing Jessica Stokes-Parish, which I'm definitely really excited about. I've been following Jess for a number of years on her amazing social media accounts, especially Instagram. Jess is a very experienced senior ICU nurse, health professional educator. She's got postgraduate degrees in education and nursing practice. She's got a PhD. Her areas of interest are health professional workforce development, policy, education and science communication. Like, this is going to go on for a while, people. She's created a CRABS framework for research credibility, which I really enjoy watching her use on her Instagram. She's got a huge social media presence around discrediting disinformation and being a good influencer. She's just recently had a promotion to Associate Dean of Student Affairs and Service Quality. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into simulation?
Yes. So I was on a night shift in the ICU, and I realized that I could not do night shifts for the rest of my life. And I applied for a job. It was a simulation coordinator, which for those people that work in simulation, it's, lab setups and coordinating different things and, making sure the sim center runs. So I applied for that thinking, I've got no idea. Like, I don't even know what this simulation business is. And I applied for it and got an interview and got the job. And that was my start of like my induction and orientation as to what simulation was and what the potential of simulation was for the healthcare community.
Nice. And like, how do you think that simulation has helped you in your career progression?
Well, 100%. Like, it's opened so many doors for me in that getting the simulation coordinator job was then a pathway into working in more traditional academia. I began to understand what academia was, what the systems were, particularly in Australia. I began to realize the power of networking. I don't think I really appreciated that as a new nurse. And I was never, as a student, I was never part of all those kind of societies or student groups. I just didn't, I didn't think I needed the time for it. And as I got into simulation, I realized that it was all about who you knew and how you connected with people and what people thought of you. And that maintaining friendships and connections and colleagues was actually what was going to be, part of the key to success in this. And I guess that's where I realized that a PhD was an opportunity for me. And once I started getting into that, I realized, like, I love this stuff. And it just really was quite an inspirational period of my life. I think that really started me on this journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can definitely relate to that. And in Māori, we're called connecting in this way, whakawhanangatanga. And yeah, it's definitely something that we really harness within our own team as well, or, the kind of concept of infiltration.
Yeah, and simulation is it's all about relationship building. I think it's fundamental. It's so critical to what we do in terms of making putting people on the edge of their learning curve and vulnerability and all of that stuff. It's
trusting.
And yeah, exactly. Like it's fascinating.
I mean, I must admit that I don't know about you, but you're quite isolated when you started out in ICU. You're kind of in this little bubble of being in your own clinical area. And then as soon as you kind of get into simulation, I can walk around the hospital, and I love the fact that I walk around the hospital and I'm saying hello to so many people from different clinical areas, and it's all through simulation that we've made these connections, and it's kind of, and it's hopefully positive connections as well.
Yeah.
We strive to make everything as positive as possible. So, it's never anybody sort of, the nurses scatter like anything when we walk onto a ward, but we still,
we're starting now to get them coming to us.
Get them
actually flocking.
Actually trying, so it's taken us 5 years, but it's got to that point now where rather than seeing them scatter into the corners, they're actually going, oh, are you doing simulation today? And they're actually wanting to do it. So
it's all about that trust, isn't it?
So long, like it takes a surprising amount of time. I think that was what I'm learning. Again, the further into it we get and the more that we're starting to see the changes, that it does take time to build that trust, and trust is massive.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your PhD?
Yes, I'd love to. It's like, have you ever seen that meme? Like you ask a scientist a question and you just can't get them to shut up. So this whole idea that scientists are hiding information is just like so unbelievable. Anyway, so my PhD looked at the use of moulage or special effects makeup in a simulated setting and how the authenticity influenced participant engagement. So the backstory to that was that I was using Moulage as part of my simulation design and setup, and to me it seemed really inauthentic. Like we were using props and things that I was like, that is so obviously fake. Why would anyone believe this, And I was like, well, then let's look at the evidence. Like, what does the evidence say about Moulage? Are we just doing this really cool, fancy thing for the sake of it, just because we like to, and it gives us something fun to do? Because, we do that, right?
Yeah.
A bit of VR because it's sexy, or, that kind of thing.
And it is weird to do stuff that's fun at work. Like, legitimately weird. Like, you do question yourself often.
You're like, oh, am I doing this for me? Or am I like...
This is too fun. Can it possibly be real?
Yeah. So that was my whole thing. And I was like, okay, let's look into the evidence. So I looked into the evidence and I could find a handful of empirical research that looked at just the use of moulage in simulation. And most of them were, they weren't high quality studies. They were very perception based. It was very much about, well, how did it make the student or the participant feel? But the overwhelming majority of evidence was all about descriptors of how to do moulage. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. So that kind of started me on my PhD. So I did a literature review, a systematic review, and then realized that to answer my question, which was about the authenticity of moulage, so is it realistic, that I'd need to develop a rating tool. So as part of my PhD, I created the Moulage authenticity rating scale, which was then used in my experiment at the end of my PhD. So I compared in that final study, a small study with final year med students in a trauma mannequin scenario. I compared no moulage to what we classified as low authenticity moulage versus high authenticity moulage.
Wow.
And like I said, it was a very small study. It was, I think I had 32 participants. I'd have to go check back on the paper. It was that long ago now. And what we found was moulage was useful in certain contexts. And so you were better off having high authenticity moulage or no moulage at all.
Right.
That middle ground of low authenticity moulage ended up causing more distraction and also contributed to the student participants skipping over assessment tasks because they didn't appreciate the severity, or they misread the severity based on the poorly defined moulage.
Fascinating.
Really interesting, and I think, calls into question a lot of what we do around moulage, and how do we get that? I think, for me, it raised more questions around, okay, well, that was with a mannequin, so what would it be different if we had a simulated participant? What might change, because the authenticity of a mannequin is already in question, right? The other part that was interesting to me, we used eye tracking technology to follow pupil direction, and that was a huge learning curve. And the data analysis was not for the faint-hearted. Frame by frame analysis of 8-minute videos and 60 frames per second.
Wow.
You can imagine how many hours of coding there was. So what we found was that in the no moulage, the participant referred to the Confederate in the scenario more often. And they looked, when they responded to those cues, they just then went straight to what they thought from their mental models about abdominal pain and things like that. They just visually went to the spot where they thought the issue would be with their eye tracking. They also relied on the monitors a lot more to give them cues. So they looked to the Confederate and the monitors more. With the low authenticity, what we found was when you look at a scan path, so it's the way that the pupils look across and what the path is that they look, it was all over the shop. And it was back and forth, up and down, back and forth, back to the Confederate, back to the monitor. So they spent a lot more time trying to make meaning, even without realizing it.
Yeah.
Whereas the high authenticity, then again, the scan path was, again, quite similar to the control of no moulage.
So interesting. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad I asked that question. Cool. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey with simulcast?
Yeah. So I sometimes feel like a pseudo member of simulcast because I have not done much. And every time Vic and I talk about the podcast, she's like, you need to do more. And she means it in the sense of, we don't hear from you. I'm like, I know, I need to get on this. And I'm hoping to talk about Moulage a lot more and simulate participants. The lovely simulcast crew got in touch with me once I finished my PhD. And they asked me to join as a producer. And so I guess, I've done a few little episodes. Vic and Ben continue with their amazing Journal Club podcast, which
awesome.
comes out every month. It's fabulous. It's so useful. But I think what I've used as the vehicle of simulcast is for us to create events. And so we've held our Simulation Reconnect event. We launched that, I guess, in the post-COVID, quote unquote. We really felt that the simulation community was a bit disjointed again, and that people were desperate for a face-to-face conference that was all about connecting with people, as opposed to, like, online conferences are great. And I think there's such a wonderful, many benefits, particularly around accessibility and so on. But we just really felt people wanted to be together. And so that's been our whole, we have our talks and so on, but a lot of it is about actually allowing space and time to just hear from each other and spend time together.
Yeah, that's awesome. And what advice would you have for the person that's kind of listening and it's like, man, I'm really interested in simulation, but I don't know where to start? What would you be your sort of advice to them?
I think I'd be interrogating a little bit more, what is it about simulation that you like? Why do you like it? What would you hope to achieve with it? Is it that you want to run simulations, in situ simulations in your clinical space? Or is it that you'd like to start working in a formal centre? Or, I feel like there's so many different, ways that you might engage with simulation. So I guess, point one would be work out which aspect it is. If you work in a hospital that has a simulation centre or that has a simulation service, then I would recommend getting in touch with those people and saying, like, can I come along? Or can I, I've got a few hours, I'm not expecting pay, but I'll come along and observe. Or is there a way that you offer training? I think the other recommendation would be find a conference. I have found conferences so instrumental for me and my growth, whether it's simulation or another field, just to get that bigger picture and to almost accelerate your knowledge and to immerse yourself in that space of, like, what's the language that they use? What are the issues of concern? You really kind of get in it.
Nice.
Cool. So you've talked a little bit in brief about simulated participants in sim, and I was going to joke about my extensive experience. I've been a simulated participant one time. But do you know what? Like, just that one time, it was sort of revolutionary for me, if I'm honest. I've always sort of said I just like role play and all of that sort of stuff. But it was an intense experience. I'm interested, we're all interested can you tell us a bit more about your work in that area, just to start off with?
Yeah, sure. So back when I first got my very first simulation job, one of the first projects that I was given 10 years ago or more was to reimagine what was called the simulated patient program at that time. So I guess just to kind of contextualize how long ago I kind of started getting into that. And then when I came to Bond, I was in a position then to be able to draw from that previous experience of reimagining a program and, re-looking at it in a different context many, many years down the track. And so that was something that was handed to me as one of my first projects when I arrived at Bond was, you've got an interest in simulation and you've got some expertise, maybe you could take a look at this. And so I think simulated participants are such a critical and valuable aspect of simulation programs, services. Our simulation program, simulated participant program at Bond University has been around for 10 or so years. And when I came in, I was like, okay, where are we at? What are we doing? And we did a benchmarking process. So there's a couple of tools out there that you can use to assess whether you meet quality standards, basically, with regards to simulated participants. So there's one that was developed by Health Education England, which is the national education aspect. And fortunately, I worked with Suzanne Goff, who was one of the developers of that in the UK when she was back in the UK as part of her PhD and a number of other things. And then, of course, there's the ASPE framework, so the Association for Standardised Patient Educators. So we used the HEE framework. It's got 5 different domains, and we basically benchmarked our program against that. Do we have processes for this? Do we have consideration for this? Have we got risk assessments? And to be honest, it wasn't quite clear what we were, where we were at. There was a lot of missing gaps. We were not really meeting that essential standard. And so that gave us a lot of opportunity then for growth and for considering new opportunities. Yes, it's been 3 years now that I've been on that particular project, and we've gone from 25 simulated participants to 75 simulated participants. We have a partnership with the local health service, and so we send our SPs there to support the simulations that are done in the hospital, the in situ sims. Yeah, it's great. And I think we've really focused a lot on a strengths-based approach to our program, and also a person-centered approach, in the sense that the program is very much driven by our simulated participants. So we've employed 3 of our actual simulated participants as as teaching fellows, and they work in the capacity of leading the program, developing professional development, educational resources. It's been really exciting and transformational and wonderful to see the opportunities that there are with that.
And those people that you're recruiting as simulated participants, are they from all walks of like?
Yeah, just from
anybody?
From the community. Yep,
Yeah.
anyone from the community. We do have really great partnerships with other local universities, so they often send our way some of their staff, and they say, look, they're great. We recommend that you would put them on your books as well, because we see that there's a benefit that they get different experiences. It helps us. You give them different training, vice versa, which is awesome. But we advertise externally just to the local community. And our particular focus in the last 6 months has been around improving the diversity of our simulated participant cohort, which is tricky to do, just in terms of like how you advertise, saying that you want somebody from, a different cultural background or whatnot.
And often it goes all the way back to where you put those advertisements as to accessibility stuff. Hey?
Yeah, one of the things that we found really useful is actually advertising as a desirable criteria that they fluently speak another language.
Yeah, totally.
So it's not an essential criteria, but it's a skill.
Yes.
And it is something that we are seeking, but that has really diversified our pool.
Yeah, and actually when we were talking with Jabeen, some of her work is around translation and translation services. And if you again, you could combine your standardized patient with, getting and using translational services to see how accurate, because she was, like, her research suggests that it's scaringly inaccurate sometimes. And so, that's like the overlaps are crazy and really cool in terms of all of that stuff as well. So we are yet to take a step into this, like all of that stuff that you've just spoken about in terms of policies and risk management. And it sounds like a lot, but again, my singular experience of doing it, it's so necessary. How do we start? What do we need to consider, like, right at the beginning, given all of your 10 years of experience?
Yeah, look, I think for me, it goes back to governance. What are the boundaries of the engagement? What existing policies are there that you can draw from? Like, every employer has policies around incident management and all of those kinds of things. So there's a lot that you can draw from. For us, it was about getting together the relevant stakeholders. So we have what we call a simulated participant reference group. So we have a representative from every program in the health faculty, and we come together once every couple of months. In the beginning, we met every month, and it was a working group. We sat there, we worked through, like, okay, how do we define simulated participants in our context? What are the skills that we need? How are we going to ensure psychological and physical safety of both the SP and the participants? And then the other side was, okay, well, what are we going to do if things go pear-shaped? What happens when I get a complaint about one of these staff members? Or what happens if I get a complaint from the staff member about a student? Or, you know, what are our pathways? And so I guess it's about having those hypotheticals and having those processes in place to protect you and to protect them. And, you know, I think, you know, we've created a culture where the SPs are very confident to come forward and say, this incident happened and it was not okay. And which is awesome. And I think, we try to maintain that approach.
Can I just ask, sorry, are they voluntary, or is it a kind of, are they paid, or so they're employed in the contract? Yeah,
ours are employed. It doesn't mean that yours have to be. It's, you know, there's pros and cons to both, and different approaches work for different contexts. But it's still all about, well, what's that governance structure? Yes. How are we going to engage them if they are voluntary? How do we engage them safely? How do we ensure that they follow our instruction? You can still do all of those things.
Yeah. Cool.
With voluntary.
Nice. Thank you. And in your experience, how is SIM with standardised patients different? Like you spoke earlier about mannequin and standardised patient simulations being different. And my first thought was, well, we can never change the skin colour of a mannequin in terms of their dead versus alive, sort of just to be really specific, but in every shade in between. And then I thought, well, that would also be quite difficult with a standardised patient without moulage and without other things. So, but obviously more broadly than that, how is it different?
Look, I guess the differences, as you've highlighted, like the physical appearance is a big one. But also, like you said, you can't change the skin colour or the appearance of a simulated participant either. And we do see many places that will ask simulated participants to act in a capacity that does not match how they look. And that I'm very strong in saying you shouldn't do that. You should be matching the authenticity of your simulated participant to the case. So there's a lot of parallels as well, that just because it's a real person doesn't mean that you can magically make a 40-year-old look like a 70-year-old. I mean, there's makeup. Yes. You can do that with makeup, right? But is that authentic to the lived experience of a 70-year-old? No. And we move into this creepy territory of ageism, stereotypes, so much. I guess the differences that I see is that when it is a real human that's interacting with you, you have a lower threshold for that fiction contract and that sense of suspension of disbelief. Where I think when you've got the mannequin, every time you look at the mannequin, you're reminded this is fake.
Yeah.
So we rarely use mannequins at Bond, and even I know that Vic and the team in the hospital rarely use mannequins unless it's like a full trauma scenario that requires intubation or, you know, it's a cardiac advanced life support type situation. We use a lot of part-task trainers and hybrid scenarios. So we would prefer to have a real human there presenting the trauma, and then we'll switch in a chest for doing, you know, an intercostal tube or needle decompression or whatever. But again, it all comes back to, well, what's the purpose of what you're doing?
Yeah.
You know, which is so much of our refrain, isn't it? That we go, oh, hang on, well, what are we actually trying to achieve here? But I think the biggest differences are that, I guess the other pros are, you know, you don't have to worry about how the mannequin feels.
Yeah, 100%.
You don't have to worry about hurting the mannequin.
Right.
Maybe the techs would disagree, but you know, there's not going to be an incident report.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. So I think there is more risk in having a simulated participant, but I think that with that risk comes a higher sense of authenticity and perhaps more payoff in other ways.
So do you have any top tips, involving using?
Oh yeah, so we frame the involvement of simulated participants as working with simulated participants. So my first point would be, if you're thinking about it, be cognizant of how you involve them and that they're part of the broader team. So this is that difference between that mannequin. They're not there just to be used. They're there part of your educational experience. Don't underestimate the preparation that's required for them to feel safe and prepared in that environment. And I guess my other piece of observation, and that kind of comes in a top tip, is just because you've worked in simulation doesn't mean you understand how to work with simulated participants. Because it is very different. And I think I see a lot of harm happen when it's just let's just chuck them in. We haven't thought about briefing them. We haven't thought about parameters of safety. We haven't thought about debriefing them and what our follow-up procedures are. And so we, as the academic that might decide to engage with an SP, we have a responsibility to make sure that we understand all of that stuff too.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Just going back, when you talked about debriefing, do you always involve them in the debrief process? Or is it kind of dependent on the simulation that you're doing?
Yeah, it's dependent. So we've got some circumstances where they will be there as part of the debrief, and they'll be asked to reflect on how it felt for them as the patient. In other circumstances where we're time limited and we don't have a 20-minute, half an hour debrief after, the academic might give a modified faces, like the pain faces and feedback. So they'll give that to the academic, will give that to the SP and say, thinking about your interactions with the participant, can you rate, how did you feel? What were your general thoughts? And then the academic uses that faces scale and feedback in their embedded debrief with the participants.
This is all just so fascinating for me, because I think we've seen such a change in simulation. I don't know whether, you've obviously seen exactly the same, that, this authenticity and this strive for authenticity in simulation is just, from, we talked to Todd Chang about VR and how that can sort of simulate and I've kind of got a background in art and design, so I've kind of been chucked into the Moulage stuff. But to be honest, one of my, when I was younger, one of the jobs that I always wanted to do was special effects. So I kind of, the fact that I can play with Moulage is just perfect for me. So I can have a bit of... But I remember listening to your podcast on Simulcast, and when you said, don't use Moulage for Moulage's sake. And it was that, I think it was that kind of, it has to have a purpose. It can't just be slapped onto a mannequin. It has to be real. It can't distract the participants. And I think that has really stuck with me amongst everything else, is that, if I'm asked to do Moulage, I want to make it as real as I can, that it's going to enhance the education of the participants. It's going to point them in the right direction, but without them kind of going, I don't know what this is, or it's too much, or oh my God, it's. So I think it's really fascinating for me listening to how you kind of, the context and everything is so important in Moulage. If other people, I'm kind of like, I dabble in it and I enjoy it. But for other people who are wanting to kind of get into it, there is a cost involved. Obviously, getting good Moulage, you have to have the right equipment. You can't just slap anything onto a mannequin. So, I mean, in terms of sort of getting started, what would your sort of top tips, if somebody out there was looking to do some decent moulage, what would your kind of top, if you were going to say, okay, buy 5 things, these are my top 5 things I would get to start a moulage kit, what would they kind of be?
A brush, a sponge, alcohol, and either alcohol paints or cream paints, and some silicone. And I'll do a little self-plug here.
Do it.
We've created some open access resources for people that are interested in moulage but don't know where to start, or they don't have time. The reality is moulage does not have to be a big 1-hour preparation, like massive trauma type. That doesn't have to be that. Some of the best moulage can be subtle signs and bruises and grazes, and those things can take 5 minutes to create. And they can easily be wiped off if they're not accurate or whatnot. So the team at Bond, I have a colleague Julia Reuter, who is working in our moulage and has created a number of resources with me around moulage. So one is a downloadable instruction book. So it's got resources around equipment to buy, step-by-step guidance on how to make a whole range of different signs and symptoms. We've also created some instructional videos on those top kind of used things. So like bruises, lacerations, grazes, burns, including sunburn and blisters and things like that. We're in the process of creating a micro-credential, so an online moulage skills course. And like you said, moulage can be really expensive, and especially if you go to a traditional face-to-face moulage masterclass, like you can be paying $1,000 for a day. We've also created a community of practice, an international community of practice. So we've called it the Virtual Moulage Community of Practice, that launched in 2022. And we've now graduated to like a regular 1-month Zoom catch up. We've got a WhatsApp group that like this morning was literally pinging with people going, how do you do this? And, there are Facebook groups online that do lots of instructional things, but I guess we were interested. I particularly am really interested for the moulage and the simulation community to look at how do we connect the research with the practitioner, and how do we share those experiences, and how do we begin to place more emphasis on the evidence behind moulage, and how do we build that as a community. And so that's what the virtual community of practice is all about, is that connection and building evidence.
I mean, it's I've kind of done moulage before, and they haven't even moved the mannequin. I've done some great moulage, which I think is great moulage. Kind of like compound fractures and things like that, and then bandage it up, and then they've never removed the bandage. And you think, damn it, why don't you remove the bandage? I spent all this time, but it's kind of like, why spend time on doing something if it's not really gonna, so I think it's kind of really making it count. I'm just really fascinated in this research about the, how does it connect to somebody's? Because I find, experiential learning is something that I'm really fascinated by, in terms of, somebody will use an experience, and that's how that's where I see my joy in simulation, is kind of if somebody has never had an experience of something, and then you can kind of use simulation to give them that experience, but it has to be authentic for them to learn from it. And it's kind of, simulation will always be simulation.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of, we can do as much research in how people feel about a situation. That, when we talk to people about virtual reality, they're trying to make an experience as authentic as possible. But at the end of the day, it's still going to be simulation. It's never going to replicate the real experience.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point of like delineation, putting that we're not actually trying to replace reality, but we are trying to reduce the suspension of disbelief that you might need to create. There is evidence around how when the moulage or the replications of reality are too real, that it can have the opposite effect too, that it, that theory of the uncanny valley and all of those kinds of things. I think I would say, so while my PhD was looking at moulage authenticity, I think we've now gone broader. So I've just had a new systematic review released looking at the broader literature on moulage use in simulation. And what was very clear was that moulage probably does not contribute to knowledge retention, but it's important for perception of experience for participants. So it's about that piece of what they saw more value, whether it's because they perceive the educator to have put more effort in.
All right.
And so therefore they go, oh, I should take this seriously too. There is an aspect around preparedness. So it prepares them for what they might encounter in the real world, and that might contribute to their emotional preparedness. So Naomi Shiner has done some work, or particularly around emotion and moulage, and how, exposing radiology students to graphic fractures then helped them on their placement to feel less stressed about seeing those visually graphic things. And then I think the other piece of opportunity that we have yet to explore is around this concept of developing empathy, and that authentic moulage has something to do with developing empathy and learning those skills and to build that.
This really fascinates me, this whole kind of concept of how people relate to things and how what we do can make such a profound difference to how people learn.
I think it repositions moulage from being this fun thing that we do because we've always done it to why are we doing this? Because there's actually some potentially very impactful aspects of using moulage in a simulation. And I think we're just scraping the surface of what that would look like. It's kind of like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when we started realizing the importance of debriefing and the different models that we use. And I feel like moulage has just been, it's just a text thing. The texts do it. It's just the setup. Don't worry about it. Whereas I feel we're almost at this threshold of actually we need to take this really seriously.
It's kind of in the same vein, I think, as like just listening to you right now in terms of like standardized participants as well. Like they seem very similar, just maybe slightly different, but the same significance, I think, is what I'm trying to say in terms of a real human telling somebody that this patient has a gunshot wound versus seeing a hole that looks like it could be a gunshot wound. Quite a different experience, a different feeling, a different visceral reaction to that observation, and again with a standardized patient, a different visceral reaction to an actual human.
There's some parallels.
It's and the profundity of that is significant.
Thank you so much, Jess. Yeah, it's been really, really fascinating. Really enjoyed it. I think for me, the biggest take home has been, around the simulated participant driving the program. Like, I love that. I really love that. And you've given us lots of kind of framework stuff to all sort of look up and go forth with, shall we say. Yeah, and your PhD has been super fascinating to hear about, and then all about kind of the moulage stuff as well. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of our podcast. It was made possible by the Starship Foundation and the Douglas Charitable Trust.
And special thanks go out to all of our amazing guests.
If you'd like to connect with us on Twitter or find out any information from any of the episodes on this podcast, just see the show notes.
Our Twitter handle is @StarshipSimProg, and our email is starshipsim@adhb.org.nz. We would love to hear from you.